At 2 o'clock in the morning on September 26, 1983, a lieutenant colonel in the Soviet Air Defense Forces was sitting in a bunker south of Moscow when the alarm went off. His name was Stanislav Petrov, and his job that night was to watch a screen. The Soviet Union had recently deployed a satellite system designed to detect American missile launches, and Petrov was the duty officer monitoring it. The system reported in red letters that a missile had been launched from the United States. Then it reported a second, then a third, a fourth, a fifth. Petrov had a procedure. The procedure was to report up the chain immediately, and the chain led to men who would have very few minutes to decide whether to launch in return. It was 3 weeks after a Soviet fighter had shot down a Korean airliner and killed everyone aboard. Relations between the two countries were about as bad as they had ever been. Everything about the moment argued for doing exactly what he had been trained to do. He did not do it. He sat in his chair, in a room full of people watching him, and reasoned it through. An American first strike would not consist of 5 missiles. It would consist of hundreds. The ground radars, which would pick up anything real a few minutes later, were showing nothing. And the new satellite system was new. He picked up the phone and reported a system malfunction, a guess, offered as a fact, with no way to know. And then he waited out the longest 20 minutes of his life to find out whether he had just let his country be destroyed. It was sunlight. High-altitude clouds over North Dakota had reflected the sun at exactly the angle to fool the satellites. Notice something about that story, because it is the reason this book exists. Petrov saved an enormous number of lives, and he did it by making a personal judgment call. But he should never have been in that position. That a single exhausted man in a bunker had to weigh the fate of the world on a hunch about cloud reflectivity was not a triumph of the human spirit. It was a design failure. Somewhere behind that night stood a long chain of decisions made by other people. To build the weapons, to build the detection system, to write the procedure, to structure the command, to arrange the world into 2 armed camps. None of those decisions were made by Petrov. They were made in rooms over years by human beings arguing with other human beings, and the arrangement they produced put a man in a chair at 2 a.m. with the wrong instructions in front of him. The name for how those rooms work and how the arrangements they produce are made, changed, defended, and overthrown is politics. We are used to hearing that word with a curl of the lip. Politics is what makes the news unbearable. Politics is the reason nothing gets done. Politics is the low, grubby business of people seeking advantage, something separate from and beneath the real business of life. I want to persuade you of something different. Politics is the machinery by which any group of human beings who disagree manage to act anyway. It is one of the 2 things our species does that nothing else on Earth does at anything like our scale, the other being language, and the 2 are not unrelated. It is old, it is deep, it is fascinating, and there is nowhere you can stand where it is not holding something up over your head. Consider how much of your day was arranged for you before you woke up. Whether the water from your tap will make you ill. Whether the drug in your medicine cabinet contains what the label says. Whether the wiring in your walls was inspected. Whether the pilot of the aircraft passing overhead was required to sleep before the flight. Whether the money in your account will buy the same amount of food this year as last. Whether the person who sold you your house actually owned it. Whether, if someone stronger than you decides to take what is yours, anything at all happens to them. Every one of these is the residue of a political decision, and almost all of them were settled long before you were born, by people who are dead, after arguments you never heard, and often at a cost you would find hard to believe. They are also, every one of them, reversible. That is the fact that makes the subject urgent rather than merely interesting. We tend to experience the political arrangements we live inside the way we experience weather as conditions as the way things are. They are not conditions. They are constructions. Each of them was built at a specific moment by identifiable people, usually in response to a catastrophe, and each of them can be dismantled by other people in a shorter time than it took to build. Here is the puzzle at the center of this book, stated as plainly as I can. Human beings evolved to live in groups of a few dozen. Everything about our instincts is calibrated to that scale. We track individuals, we hold grudges, we repair friendships, we notice cheaters. We care intensely what a small number of people think of us. Put 150 of us together and the machinery works beautifully, with no government at all. There are now more than 8 billion of us. Somehow, most of the time, in most places, we do not descend into permanent war. Strangers hand each other goods and money. Enormous projects get completed by people who will never meet. Disputes that would once have been settled with blood get settled by two people in a room with a third person listening. Power passes from one leader to another, and, in some countries, some of the time, which is a far stranger achievement than it sounds, the one who loses simply goes home. None of this is natural. All of it was invented. Most of it was invented late, at appalling expense, by people who had just finished watching The Alternative. The question of how creatures built for the campfire came to run a planet, and how they keep it from flying apart, is the great question of political science. And the honest answer is that we have been improvising for 5,000 years, that many of our improvisations have failed catastrophically, and that we are still, right now, in the middle of the experiment. This book follows one question through the whole of that story. Who decides? We will begin before there were governments at all, in a world where our ancestors spent tens of thousands of years actively hunting down anyone who tried to become a boss, because equality, it turns out, is not humanity's natural condition, but one of its oldest and most deliberate achievements. We will watch that arrangement break when the grain came in, and see the first kings appear on a hot floodplain in Iraq, and see writing invented not to make poetry but to record what people owed. We will stand in front of a black stone pillar, on which a Babylonian king made one of the first public promises about how a state would treat the people under it. We will listen to a small, quarrelsome Greek city invent the astonishing idea that ordinary people might rule themselves, and then execute a philosopher for asking too many questions about it. We will follow a Chinese teacher arguing that a ruler's example matters more than his laws, and a Florentine official who described power exactly as he found it and has been called wicked ever since for the crime of accuracy. We will watch a handful of men in a hot room in Philadelphia try to design a government on the explicit assumption that everyone who ever runs it will be selfish and untrustworthy, including themselves. We will trace the 3,000-year fight over who counts as one of the people, a fight that has been won, repeatedly, by people who were told they were not part of it, and which is not finished. We will see scholars in the last century attempt to turn all of this into a genuine science, with data and equations and experiments, and find out how much of politics that captures and how much it misses. And we will end in our own moment and past it. With democracies under strain, with populations who no longer trust the arrangements they inherited, with problems that cross every border we have drawn, and with the newest question of all, what becomes of a 5,000-year-old machine for making decisions when some of the deciding starts to be done by machines? A word about how I intend to treat the contested parts, since a good deal of what follows is contested. Where the evidence is strong, I will say so. Where scholars disagree, I will tell you that they disagree and try to represent the best version of each side, rather than the most convenient one. Where a beloved story has been undermined by later research, and several of the most beloved stories in this field have been, I will say that too, even when the true version is duller. And on the live political arguments of our own decade, I'm going to try very hard to explain rather than to persuade. Not out of cowardice, but because a book that tells you what to think about the controversies of 2026 will be worthless in 2046, whereas a book that shows you the machinery underneath them might not be. You are entirely capable of reaching your own conclusions. What I can offer is a longer view than the news allows, the knowledge that this argument has happened before, in Athens, in Rome, in Paris, in Philadelphia, and that we know something about how it went. One last thing before we begin at the beginning. There is a temptation reading political history to become cynical. The catalog of massacres, betrayals, stolen elections, and comfortable men explaining why the arrangement that benefits them is also just, it is long, and it is real, and I will not be hiding it. But hold on to the other half. Everything decent in political life had to be thought of by somebody. The idea that an accused person should hear the charges against them. The idea that a soldier answers to a civilian. The idea that a ruler's power should stop at your front door. The idea that you can say the government is wrong out loud in public and go home to your dinner. The idea that when you lose an election you leave the building. Not one of these is obvious. Not one of these is common in the long view of history. H was proposed by someone, resisted by someone, fought for, written down, and defended, usually by people who did not live to see it work. They are, in the most literal sense, inventions. And like all inventions, they can be improved and forgotten and lost. So 8 billion of us on one planet, wanting different things, unable to leave and obliged to decide. Who decides?